In the early decades of the 19th century, Edinburgh was a city of two faces. By daylight, it was the Athens of the north, a place of science, progress, and intellectual brilliance. Scholars debated philosophy in candlelit halls, doctors advanced the science of medicine, and young students came from across Europe to learn. But when night fell, the streets told a different story. Beneath the glitter of learning and progress, Edinburgh hid a world of poverty, shadows, and fear. Narrow closes and wynds, the twisting alleyways that cut between the old stone tenements, became dens of sickness, crime, and despair. The city's medical schools were thriving, yet with their success came an unusual and sinister problem: cadavers. Doctors needed bodies to teach their students anatomy, but the law allowed only the corpses of executed criminals, and there were far too few of those to meet the growing demand. This hunger for knowledge fed a darker trade: body snatching. Graveyards were watched at night, coffins chained, and families stood vigil over fresh graves, terrified that their loved ones would be stolen in the dark. It was in this atmosphere, where science clashed with superstition and greed with morality, that two men would step from the shadows. Their names, William Burke and William Hare. Together they would transform Edinburgh's fear of grave-robbing into something far worse: a series of murders so shocking that the city would never forget. William Burke and William Hare, two ordinary Irishmen who drifted into Edinburgh, men who might otherwise have vanished into the background of the city's poor. But fate would carve their names into history. Burke was born in County Tyrone, Ireland, in 1792. He had once been a labourer, a family man, even a soldier. By the time he arrived in Edinburgh, he was separated from his wife and living with a woman named Helen MacDougall. Those who knew him described him as charming, almost cheerful, a man quick to smile, with a gift for gaining trust. Hare, on the other hand, was rougher. Also an Irish immigrant, he worked menial jobs and was known for his temper and heavy drinking. He lodged at Tanner's Close, a ramshackle boarding house run by his partner, Margaret Laird. Unlike Burke, Hare was not a man people warmed to. He was harsh, blunt, and mercenary. The two men's paths crossed in Edinburgh's slums, bound together by poverty and opportunity. They became fast companions, not because of loyalty or friendship, but because each saw in the other a means to survive. At first, they worked odd jobs, carried loads, drank in taverns, and lived on the edge of respectability. But in 1827, a chance event changed everything. A lodger in Hare's boarding house, an elderly man, died owing rent. But he had died owing £4 of rent, money Hare insisted he must somehow recover. Most men would have buried the body and taken the loss, but Hare was not most men. With Burke's help, they came up with a grim solution. They removed Donald's body from his coffin and filled the box with bark and stones to simulate weight. The funeral passed without suspicion. Meanwhile, the corpse was delivered in secret to Dr. Robert Knox. Knox examined the body and, without question, paid handsomely. For Burke and Hare, this was not only profit, it was revelation. Bodies were in short supply, surgeons would not ask questions, and death could be turned into business. Not long after, opportunity came again. A sickly miller lodged in Hare's boarding house. This time the two men did not wait for nature to take its course. They smothered him quietly, pressing a pillow over his face while Burke held him down. No blood, no noise. The method was simple, efficient, and left the body undamaged.
The payment from Knox was generous. far more than days of hard labor could earn. And with it, Burke and Hare crossed the line from opportunists to murderers. Over the coming months, they would perfect their method, what history would come to call burking. A hand clamped over the mouth and nose, the weight of a man on the chest, until silence. It was quick. It was quiet. And to the medical schools of Edinburgh, it was just another body for science. But to the city itself, a shadow had been born. For in the dark closes and alleys of Edinburgh, the poor and forgotten were no longer safe. Because Burke and Hare had discovered the value of human life, not in living, but in dying. By early 1828, Burke and Hare had crossed the threshold. Death was no longer an accident or an opportunity. It was a trade. The two men realized that the demand for bodies in Edinburgh's medical schools was constant. Dr. Robert Knox's lecture halls were crowded, his reputation growing, and his appetite for fresh cadavers seemed endless. Each time they brought him a corpse, the payment was immediate, no questions asked. Word spread quietly among the students. Knox always had the freshest specimens. None of them stopped to ask where the bodies came from. In truth, none wanted to know. For Burke and Hare, the method of killing, smothering without blood, leaving the body whole, became routine. They refined it into something mechanical. A hand clamped over the mouth and nose, the weight of a man on the chest, until silence. It was quick. It was quiet. And to the medical schools of Edinburgh, it was just another body for science. But to the city itself, a shadow had been born. For in the dark closes and alleys of Edinburgh, the poor and forgotten were no longer safe, because Burke and Hare had discovered the value of human life, not in living, but in dying. For Edinburgh's medical schools, the business of death meant progress. For the people of Edinburgh's slums, it meant terror.
By the spring of 1828, the killings had become a pattern. Burke and Hare no longer stumbled into opportunities. They hunted. And the people of Edinburgh's slums, desperate and forgotten, became the chosen prey. Let us remember them, not as nameless shadows, but as victims of a trade in flesh. Mary Patterson and Janet Brown. The first well-known victims were two young women, Mary Patterson and her friend Janet Brown. They were lured with promises of drink and warmth at Hare's lodging house, but only Janet left alive. Mary never saw the sun again. Her body was delivered fresh to Dr. Knox's table the very next morning. Students whispered at the beauty of the corpse, but none dared ask questions. Mrs. Hostler, the beggar woman. Next came a frail beggar woman. She was elderly, weak, with nowhere to sleep but the streets. Burke and Hare offered her shelter. She accepted, and within hours, she too was suffocated in silence. To Knox, she was just another specimen. To Edinburgh, she vanished without trace. Effie, the salt seller. Effie, a poor woman who sold salt in the streets, was cheerful, well known in her neighborhood. Burke and Hare brought her in with cheap whiskey, but once again, the same method. Hand over mouth, weight on chest, until the laughter was gone. Her body fetched good money. For the killers, she was coin. For her neighbors, just another empty space where a familiar voice had been. Children and unknowns. There were others, nameless, forgotten, recorded only in fragments. A young boy, no older than 12, lured with treats and kindness. An unknown woman, sickly and desperate. Each body vanished into Knox's dissecting rooms, stripped of identity, reduced to anatomy. Daft Jamie, or James Wilson. But one victim stood apart. James Wilson, known on the streets as Daft Jamie. He was a disabled young man, slow in speech but kind, loved by the poor who knew him. When he went missing, people noticed, and when his body appeared in Knox's class with his recognizable limp and deformed foot, even the students grew uneasy. Knox quickly deflected suspicion, but whispers spread. This was not a nameless stranger. This was Jamie, and his death would help bring the killers down. Margaret Docherty, the last victim. Finally came Margaret Docherty, an elderly woman of Irish descent. She was invited to celebrate with drink in Burke's house, but she too was murdered in the same chilling fashion. But this time, however, their crime would not remain hidden. Neighbors grew suspicious. The trail of death was about to end, but not before at least 16 lives had been claimed.
Closing lines of chapter. In less than a year, Burke and Hare had slaughtered men, women, and even children. Each victim carried a name, a story, a life. But in Edinburgh, those lives were sold for science and for greed. The victims were not forgotten, though their killers hoped they would be, for in their deaths they left behind a legacy of terror that still echoes in Edinburgh's haunted closes. By late 1828, Edinburgh was no longer the proud Athens of the North. The city that once shone with the light of science and learning now quivered under the shadow of death. People whispered in taverns, in markets, in the narrow closes of the old town. Who would be next? Every missing face, every closed door, every rumor of sickness became a spark for terror. Distrust of the poorhouses. The poor and homeless, already at the bottom of society, were most vulnerable. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Drunken men feared sleep. The poor believed anyone offering food or shelter might be leading them to slaughter. To the rich, the victims were invisible, but to the working class, every disappearance cut deep, and suspicion poisoned the streets. Students and Knox. Inside Dr. Knox's anatomy school, unease spread among the students. The bodies arriving were too fresh, too intact. Some carried familiar faces. A boy with a twisted foot, a woman known in the market. Whispers turned into accusations. These are not the dead of graveyards. These are the murdered among us. And yet, Knox asked no questions, his scalpel flashing under candlelight as Edinburgh's future doctors carved into stolen lives. Haunted city. By night, the closes of Edinburgh felt haunted. Fog clung to the cobblestones, and every echo of footsteps brought dread. Neighbors avoided each other, for trust had withered. Some swore they saw ghostly figures at windows, victims watching silently. It was said that the city itself felt cursed, that very air stank of death.
Fear turned to anger. Soon fear turned to rage. The people wanted answers. They wanted names. They wanted to know who had turned their city of enlightenment into a slaughterhouse. And when suspicion finally fell upon Burke and Hare, Edinburgh was ready to explode. Opening suspense. By October 1828, William Burke and William Hare had grown reckless. For nearly a year, their grim trade had gone unchecked, each body sold without consequence. But greed has a way of loosening caution, and their final crime would expose them forever. Margaret Docherty enters. On the night of October 31st, a poor Irish woman named Margaret Doherty crossed their path. She was elderly, homeless, and vulnerable, the perfect victim in their eyes. Burke, ever the manipulator, invited her to stay in his lodging for the night. He promised warmth, food, and company. Doherty accepted, never knowing she had stepped into a house of death. As night fell, Burke and Hare drank heavily with her, pretending friendship. Their wives joined in the merriment, all laughter masking the grim fate awaiting the old woman. But something changed that night. Unlike before, there were witnesses. Two other lodgers, Anne and James Gray, noticed Margaret Doherty was missing the next morning. When they pressed Burke for answers, he grew evasive. Suspicion took root. Discovery of the body. Burke had hidden Doherty's body beneath a pile of straw in his room. When the Grays returned unexpectedly, curiosity led them to lift the straw, and what they found froze them in horror. There, lifeless and cold, lay the body of Margaret Doherty. The Grays fled in terror and reported what they had seen to the police. The arrest. The following day, officers stormed Burke's lodging. They uncovered Doherty's corpse, still warm, still fresh, undeniable evidence. For the first time, the killers had been caught red-handed. The business of death had reached its end. And with Margaret Doherty's tragic murder, the nightmare of Burke and Hare was finally dragged into the light. Public outrage. By December 1828, the arrest of William Burke and William Hare had shaken Edinburgh to its core. The news spread like wildfire. Ordinary citizens, students, doctors, even the highest classes spoke of nothing else. The murders were no longer whispers in taverns. They were front-page scandal. Hare turns informer. But justice would not treat them equally. Faced with the gallows, William Hare struck a bargain. He agreed to testify against Burke in exchange for immunity. The city seethed with rage. The man who had helped kill so many would walk free, while his partner would carry the full weight of the law. The courtroom. On Christmas Eve 1828, the trial began at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. The chamber was overflowing. Nobles, townsfolk, students, even reporters from London. All eyes were fixed on William Burke. The evidence was damning. The testimony of the Grays, who had discovered Margaret Doherty's body. The words of Hare, betraying his partner with cold precision. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. On Christmas morning, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. The court sentenced William Burke to death by hanging. His wife, Helen MacDougall, was acquitted for lack of evidence, though she barely escaped the fury of the mob outside the courtroom. The execution. On January 28, 1829, thousands gathered in Edinburgh's Lawn Market to witness Burke's execution. It was said that nearly 25,000 people filled the streets. As the noose tightened, the crowd cheered. The man who had sold the lives of the poor for coin was himself sold to death. In a final twist of irony, Burke's body was delivered to the anatomy theater, dissected before a crowd of students, his skeleton preserved as a warning for generations to come. The legacy of the trial. The trial of Burke and Hare exposed a dark truth, that science and greed had conspired in silence, and innocent lives had been the price. From that day, the word Burking entered the English language, forever tied to murder by suffocation. And in Edinburgh, the terror of those nights lingered long after the courtroom fell silent. The morning of January 28, 1829. The morning was bitterly cold. By dawn, tens of thousands crowded Edinburgh's Maun Market. They came not out of pity, but to see justice. Some had lost friends to the killers. Others simply wanted to witness the fall of a man who had sold human life for coin. William Burke, pale and weary, was led to the scaffold. A hush fell as the rope was fixed around his neck. The execution. Burke stood silent as the crowd jeered. When the trap was released, the executioner's work was swift. The mob roared its approval. The man who had suffocated his victims with silence met his end before a sea of voices demanding vengeance. The dissection. But Burke's punishment did not end on the gallows. As decreed by the court, his body was delivered to the anatomy theater. There, before a packed room of students, professors, and officials, his corpse was dissected. Ironically, he had become the very commodity he once traded. The professor dipped his quill into Burke's blood, writing in the record book, "This is written with the blood of William Burke." His skeleton was preserved, a grim reminder of science entangled with murder. Aftermath in Edinburgh. The case left Edinburgh shaken. Fear gave way to outrage, and outrage gave way to reform. The public demanded stricter laws against body snatching, and medical schools could no longer turn a blind eye to the shadow trade that had fueled Burke and Hare's crimes. By 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed in Britain, ensuring legal access to bodies for study and putting an end to the shadow trade that had fueled Burke and Hare's crimes. Yet the legacy endured. For decades, people used the word Burking to describe silent suffocation. Children were warned in whispers, mothers clutching them close, "Stay safe, or Burke and Hare will get you."
Today, Burke's skeleton still hangs in Edinburgh, and Hare's name is forever cursed. The story of Burke and Hare remains a dark echo of how greed, science, and death intertwined, and how a city paid the price. The curse of their names. Even after the trials, executions, and reforms, the shadow of Burke and Hare refused to die. Their names became a curse, whispered in fear. Parents warned children not to wander at night, lest Burke and Hare come for them. The word burking entered the English language, meaning to suffocate a victim silently, without a trace. The Anatomy Act of 1832 tried to close the wound. It gave doctors legal access to unclaimed bodies, stripping power from grave robbers and killers for profit. Yet, even with reform, the scar remained. For Edinburgh, the city of science and enlightenment, the murders were a reminder. Progress had been bought with blood. Tourist attraction of the macabre. Today, Burke's skeleton still hangs in Edinburgh's Surgeons' Hall Museum, displayed behind glass. His death mask stares back at visitors, cold and expressionless. The very tools of his punishment, the rope, the stake, the documents, survive as relics, proof of how real the nightmare once was. Echoes across centuries. In plays, books, and films, the names Burke and Hare live on. Their story is retold, reshaped, and remembered, not just as crime, but as warning. A warning of what happens when greed collides with desperation, and when human life is reduced to currency. The final reflection. And so the legacy of terror endures. More than murderers, Burke and Hare became symbols of fear, of corruption, of the darkness lurking within desperate men. Centuries may have passed, but in Edinburgh's misty closes and cobbled streets,
their story lingers. Listen closely on a foggy night, and you may still hear footsteps in the dark. Burke and Hare, searching for their next victim.